Hello, and I'm going to make a very perhaps surprising video about May Day, which happens to be tomorrow, and how it is connected with some other festivals, including Easter. The Orthodox Easter is in a couple of days as well. You may think, no, the two are not connected, but something is connected to something else, and that is connected to something else. And in human culture, everything is eventually connected to everything. So I'm going to start at the beginning. A very long time ago, in the time of the Neolithic period, and we have there some sort of indication that the people at that time had some sort of primitive sense of space and time and diaries, and had some idea of the months of the year and so on. And we find this evidence, among else, in the various stone monuments that they built. For example, Stonehenge is a very famous one, and that is aligned on one side, so its main cardinal axis and various other monuments that are associated with Stonehenge form a line, so to speak, that on one side has the sunrise at the summer solstice, and at the other end, if you look behind you in the opposite direction, that's the location of the sunset at the winter solstice. And so at the summer solstice, we have also celebration. In the past, they were celebrated the death of St. John the Baptist, and the Christian calendar, and in the winter solstice we're celebrating, obviously we're still celebrating Christmas, and in ancient times it was a celebration called the Yule or Hill. That was the name for sun. Yule and Hill, and you find the celebration in places like Scandinavia and so on. It's still surviving. It's another name. The name Yule also is found in English for Christmas. Sometimes you use also an alternative word for Christmas. Actually, it's the word an old word for the sun. And so we have this axis. So that's a well-known axis. It's not the case that all stone monuments of the Neolithic period are aligned to this axis. Not all stone circles and so on are aligned to this axis. Some are aligned to the axis of the equinoxes, the spring equinox and the autumn equinox. On those days, we still have festivals today. We have the festival of the Annunciation of the Virgin in March during the spring equinox. And I believe the festival of the Cross is around the time of the autumn equinox. But surprisingly, there were also a few monuments that were not aligned to the solstices and the equinoxes, and they were aligned instead to the sunrise on the 1st of May or thereabouts, and the sunset around the end of October. And we again have festivals at around that time. We have May Day and Halloween. Now there is this kind of relatively modern idea that's repeated everywhere that Halloween has something to do with All Hallows Eve and this and that. There used to be a 3-day festival in very ancient times in the British Isles that in Ireland was called Samhain. Now, Samhain is not the same as Halloween, but Samhain means summer's end or sun's end, the end of the sun. And there is an equivalent sort of word you can make in Breton called Halloween. So Hal is the Breton word for sun, as opposed to so-in or so-win. You wouldn't say so-win in Breton, you say Halloween. And so most likely Halloween is the origin of Halloween that we have today. And Halloween would have been the equivalent in Breton for the Irish festival of Samhain. So Halloween or Samhain would have been a festival, a commemoration of dead ancestors, because some burial mounds are aligned with this axis, this sort of 1st of May to end of October axis. And there used to be a 3-day festival, which was later replaced with the Festival of All Saints or whatever. And in May we have rather the beginning of summer, so to speak. But let's now focus on May Day. So May Day was a festival of the Greek and Roman period. It was particularly celebrated in Italy. It referred to a minor deity called Maius. Maius was the son of Maia. Maia was rather a goddess in charge of the labor, childbirth, and midwifery. In fact, the word Maia in Greek is the word for midwife. And she was a minor deity that had assumed some of the duties normally afforded to Hera, because Hera was originally the goddess of things like childbirth, motherhood, midwifery, and so on. But in southern Italy, Maia took that role. And her son was Maius. Like 2 or 3 other ancient gods, he was resurrected. He was resurrected every spring. That perhaps reminds you of something, and that's we'll get to that later. So he's resurrected every spring on May Day, and then he would live until the summer solstice, and then he would pass away, and then he would be reincarnated next year. On the 1st of May, he was celebrating the following way. There were flowers gathered, and a wreath was made, a flower wreath, and then there was a ceremony enacted among children that I still remembered from the days of my youth in Athens as a small child, about 50 years ago. I seem to think it was still going on, but the sort of lack or loss of public spaces has made it somehow. It's not the required must to continue, traditions like that. But it was a real ancient tradition. It has nothing to do with Christianity. So it was still celebrating the ancient way. A youth was lying on the ground, on the earth, and he was the representation of Maius. And he would be resurrected every time on the 1st of May, and the various little girls will go over to him and will tell him to rise, and will place this flower wreath that they had brought with them on his head. And then they will all kind of join together into some kind of sing-along. They will sing a song that I can no longer remember the words of, and presumably someone somewhere has recorded it. It will be interesting to see what it says. Similar customs are also celebrated in Romania, not just in Greece, and there are May Day-related customs also in the UK with maypoles and so on, but the girls dance around a maypole as opposed to the dead Maius who's been resurrected. When the ceremony has been enacted, this kind of sing-along and little dance and so on, then the flower wreath is taken to the house, and it's hung somewhere outside the house, probably on the main door or on a balcony or some other obvious place outside the house, and it's kept there until the summer solstice. And then on the night of the summer solstice is set alight. It's obviously dried up by then. And that festival was known in the Middle Ages as St. John's Fires, and I believe it was still celebrated in parts of the world. I also remember it from Greece, but also in the UK. It was celebrated until a couple of generations ago. So that's about May Day. So there were, interestingly enough, as I said, 2 other gods that were celebrated for sort of dying and then being resurrected every spring. And these were Persephone and Dionysus. So they were among the 12 gods of Olympus, or one of them or both of them, however one designs, or prefers, according to local preferences, who the 12 gods of Olympus were. And Persephone was the goddess of Demeter. Demeter in Doric was Damata, which is the same as Erdmutter in German, and Earth Mother in English. It's the same sort of word, Damata in Doric. And it means Earth Mother, Demeter in Attic. And she was the original goddess of probably the original Earth goddess or Earth Mother that eventually became one of the 12 gods of Olympus. And she was the goddess of corn, of wheat, and so on. She was the goddess of the earth that provided for all, and her daughter was Persephone. Now, Persephone at some point was stolen away by Hades, who took her as his wife. And at that point, when she disappeared underground, Demeter apparently laid the earth waste. And so the gods intervened and convinced Hades to allow Persephone to return to the upper world every spring. And so every spring, Persephone is being resurrected. And now Persephone's consort happens to be Dionysus. And Dionysus would also die every year after the vine has dried up at the end of autumn, and then he would be resurrected once again in the spring when the vines start blossoming once again. they were both celebrated in an interesting way. There were a kind of sacrifice made to them as a celebration. It wasn't the usual sacrifice that you probably think about. Most other gods were propitiated with sacrifices of animals. And by the way, this is also very interesting. The animals would not just be allowed to burn until they became ash. Instead, they would, as soon as the smell of the burning flesh would rise to the heavens, the sacrifice was complete, and then the animal would be offered to the faithful in a feast. And that was the main opportunity most people had in ancient times to eat meat. They would eat meat at the end of a sacrifice in a feast. And so what that means is that when something was sacrificed, its flesh will become an offering, a sacred offering to the people, to the faithful. Now, unlike these sorts of sacrifices and the feasts on animal flesh, Persephone and Dionysus were also afforded a kind of sacrifice, but a very different one. It had nothing to do with sacrificing an animal. Instead, there were offerings of wine or bread, if that rings a bell. And so bread for Persephone, who was the daughter of Demeter, who was the goddess of corn. Her flesh was, so to speak, bread. It wasn't some animal or something. And she was, propitiated and celebrated with offerings of bread, and the faithful would eat bread rather than the flesh of an animal. In the case of Dionysus, in autumn especially, when the wine was ready, it was a kind of mystery, it was called in ancient times. It was a kind of mystical celebration. People would drink wine and get drunk and celebrate and have this bizarre sort of mystical sort of dancing experience of some kind. They feasted on wine, and wine was the kind of body of Dionysus, since Dionysus was the god of vines. And so when Christianity wanted to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, they somehow decided, I guess, somehow intentionally or unintentionally, this kind of legend circulated about how at the Last Supper Jesus had offered to his disciples bread and wine and had said, "This is my flesh and blood." And that would have kind of reminded the people of that time of the similar resurrection of Dionysus and Persephone, how they were celebrated with the drinking of wine and the eating of bread. And of course, at that time also Jesus Christ announced his resurrection, and of course his crucifixion was a kind of sacrifice. Yeah. And so there's a parallel there, and these three festivals do happen to occur, or three festivals in ancient times, two in modern times, Easter and May Day, do happen to occur at around about the same time, so it's unlikely they're entirely unconnected with one another and with the modern celebrations. There's another aspect to all this, Easter eggs, that also has an origin in ancient times, if you were wondering where that comes from. In Italy, again, there was a celebration. There were various kind of pottery and so on that shows that there was something about the offering of eggs even before Christianity. And that was associated with the worship of Orpheus, who was the son of Apollo, who was a who was a god connected with the sun. And so Orpheus was every morning singing hymns to the sun. He was known as being a great musician and composer, like his father Apollo. And he would celebrate the sun, and the sun would rise and set every day. So we have again this kind of cycle of kind of resurrection of the sun, the daily resurrection of the sun. But in addition, the sacred there seems to be a kind of sacred kind of symbol of some kind in the worship of Orpheus that involved the egg. And apparently the egg, he was considered in some sacred context as being a symbol of rebirth or something like that. You can imagine the connection there. And so then the egg was also associated with Easter, potentially because of all these other of these other ancient festivals. So all these ancient festivals, would have somehow strung a chord in ancient times. Yeah, how do we celebrate a resurrection? Okay, with wine, with bread, with eggs, would have been the thing to spring in mind to everybody's, mind in those days in ancient times. And they became consolidated, and even the Holy Communion consists of wine and bread nowadays. And the mystery continues, the ancient mystery continues for a day. So that was my summary of the May Day and the festivals of resurrection of ancient gods that somehow are with us still today. Thank you for listening.